The morning sun cast long shadows across Camp Riverside's training grounds as Sarah Chun adjusted the titanium and carbon fiber prosthetic that had replaced her left leg below the knee. The mechanical click of the locking mechanism echoed in the pre-dawn silence, a sound that had become as familiar to her as her own heartbeat. What happened next would either validate 3 years of relentless preparation or confirm every doubt that had been whispered behind her back since the day she'd enlisted in the Army Reserve's most demanding physical fitness program. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The thunderous roar of boots hitting pavement would soon fill the air, but first came something far more devastating than any sprint or obstacle course. It started with a single snicker from Staff Sergeant Mike Thompson, a decorated veteran whose chest bore enough ribbons to fill a small museum. That snicker would spread like wildfire through the ranks of 28 elite soldiers, each one handpicked for their exceptional athletic abilities and combat readiness. Sarah had arrived at Camp Riverside 3 weeks earlier with nothing but a worn duffel bag, her prosthetic leg carefully packed in its protective case, and a determination that burned brighter than the Georgia sun. At 26 years old, she stood 5 feet 6 inches tall with shoulder-length black hair that she kept pulled back in a regulation ponytail. Her almond-shaped eyes held a quiet intensity that most people mistook for shyness. But those who knew her understood it was the focused gaze of someone who had learned to see opportunity where others saw only obstacles. The Army Reserve's Advanced Combat Fitness Initiative was no ordinary training program. It was a brutal 12-week gauntlet designed to identify and develop the most physically capable soldiers in the entire southeastern region. Only 30 candidates had been selected from over 2,000 applications, and the dropout rate historically hovered around 70%. The program's reputation was built on its uncompromising standards and the legendary difficulty of its final challenge, a grueling obstacle course race that had broken the spirits of countless would-be warriors. Sarah's journey to this moment had begun 3 years earlier in a very different setting. She had been working as a biomedical engineer for a major medical device company in Atlanta, designing prosthetic limbs for military veterans and civilian amputees. Her life had been comfortable, predictable, and entirely removed from the world of combat boots and drill sergeants. She lived in a modest apartment overlooking Piedmont Park, spent her weekends hiking the North Georgia mountains, and had built a quiet but fulfilling existence around her passion for helping others regain their mobility. The accident that changed everything happened on a rainy Tuesday evening in March. Sarah had been driving home from a late meeting when a drunk driver ran a red light and slammed into the driver's side of her Honda Civic at 60 miles per hour. The impact crushed her left leg so severely that doctors at Grady Memorial Hospital had no choice but to amputate below the knee. She spent 6 weeks in the hospital, followed by months of physical therapy, learning to walk again with the same type of prosthetic devices she had spent years designing for others. The irony wasn't lost on her. For 5 years, she had created mobility solutions for people she had never truly understood. She had approached their challenges from a purely technical perspective, focusing on joint mechanics, weight distribution, and material durability. But lying in that hospital bed, staring at the bandaged stump where her left leg used to be, she realized that all her engineering expertise had never prepared her for the psychological weight of losing a limb. The first time she attempted to walk with her new prosthetic leg, she fell within 3 steps. The second attempt lasted 8 steps before she lost her balance and crashed into a physical therapy mat. By the 10th attempt, she was crying tears of frustration while her physical therapist, a patient woman named Dr. Rebecca Martinez, encouraged her to keep trying. It took 3 months before Sarah could walk from her hospital room to the cafeteria without assistance, and another 2 months before she felt confident enough to return to work. But something fundamental had changed during those months of recovery. The comfortable predictability of her old life no longer satisfied her. She found herself drawn to stories of athletes and soldiers who had overcome similar challenges, spending hours reading about Paralympic runners, military veterans who had returned to active duty after losing limbs, and ordinary people who had accomplished extraordinary things despite their physical limitations. She began to understand that her accident hadn't just taken away her leg. It had revealed something about herself that she had never known existed. The decision to enlist in the Army Reserve came gradually, then all at once. Sarah had been visiting the Atlanta VA Medical Center to consult on a prosthetic design project when she encountered Master Sergeant Jennifer Rodriguez, a combat veteran who had lost both legs in an IED explosion in Afghanistan. Rodriguez was participating in a rehabilitation program, training for the Warrior Games, and her intensity during a workout session left Sarah speechless. After Rodriguez finished her routine, Sarah approached her with questions about the prosthetic equipment she was using. The conversation that followed lasted 3 hours and covered everything from the technical specifications of military-grade prosthetics to the psychological challenges of rebuilding one's identity after a life-changing injury. But what struck Sarah most was Rodriguez's casual mention of her plans to return to active duty. "You can do that?" Sarah had asked, incredulous. Rodriguez had smiled, an expression that combined amusement with something harder to define. "The military doesn't care if you have one leg or two, as long as you can do the job. Physical standards are physical standards. If you can meet them, you're in. If you can't, you're out. Simple as that." That conversation planted a seed that grew into an obsession. Sarah began researching military fitness standards, studying the specific requirements for various roles and specializations. She learned that the Army had recently updated its policies regarding service members with prosthetic limbs, opening doors that had been closed for decades. More importantly, she discovered that the Advanced Combat Fitness Initiative was actively recruiting candidates who could demonstrate exceptional physical capabilities, regardless of their background or physical modifications. The application process had been more complex than anything Sarah had ever undertaken. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Beyond the standard military paperwork, she had been required to submit detailed medical documentation about her prosthetic leg, undergo extensive psychological evaluation, and complete a preliminary fitness assessment that would have challenged most professional athletes. The preliminary assessment alone had taken 6 months of preparation, during which Sarah had transformed her entire life around a single goal. She had resigned from her engineering position, converted her apartment into a makeshift gym, and hired a former Marine Corps drill instructor named Coach Williams to design her training program. Every morning at 5 a.m., she would strap on her prosthetic leg and begin a routine that included distance running, obstacle course training, strength conditioning, and endless repetitions of the specific movements that would be required during the official assessment. The preliminary fitness test had been conducted at a military installation outside Atlanta, where Sarah had been required to complete a modified version of the Army Combat Fitness Test alongside 12 other candidates. The test included a 3-mile run, maximum push-ups and sit-ups, a 250-meter sprint, and a complex obstacle course that simulated combat conditions. Sarah had not only passed every component, but had scored in the top 20% of all candidates, earning her a spot in the Advanced Combat Fitness Initiative. The acceptance letter had arrived on a Thursday afternoon, delivered by a uniformed courier who waited while Sarah signed for the official documents. Her hands had trembled as she read the formal language confirming her selection, but it wasn't fear that caused the shaking. It was the overwhelming realization that she was about to embark on the most challenging experience of her life, surrounded by people who would judge her solely on her ability to keep up with their extraordinary Standards. Camp Riverside had been designed in the 1940s as a training facility for paratroopers, and its layout reflected the uncompromising nature of military efficiency. The barracks were Spartanly functional, with narrow bunks and metal lockers that could barely accommodate the gear required for the program. The dining hall served meals that prioritized nutrition over flavor, and the recreational facilities consisted of a single television in a common area that was rarely used because candidates were either training or sleeping. Sarah's first impression of the facility had been shaped by the sight of her fellow candidates. They were an intimidating collection of physical specimens, each one clearly accustomed to pushing their bodies to extraordinary limits. There was Marcus Johnson, a former college football player whose massive frame made him look like he could bench press a small car. Jessica Martinez was a former Olympic swimmer whose lean muscle definition suggested she could probably swim across Lake Michigan without breaking a sweat. David Kim had been a competitive marathon runner before enlisting, and his casual mention of completing Boston in under 2 hours and 40 minutes had left Sarah feeling inadequate. But it was the casual cruelty of their initial reactions to her prosthetic leg that had truly shocked her. She had expected some curiosity, perhaps even some awkward questions about her capabilities. What she hadn't anticipated was the immediate assumption that she was either a publicity stunt or a diversity checkbox that the military was required to include. The comments had started during her first meal in the dining hall. Sarah had been navigating the cafeteria line, balancing her tray while managing the subtle adjustments required to walk naturally with her prosthetic, when she overheard Staff Sergeant Thompson talking to a group of candidates at a nearby table. "I don't know what bureaucrat thought it was a good idea to include someone with a fake leg in a program like this," Thompson had said, his voice carrying clearly across the room. "This isn't the Special Olympics. We're supposed to be identifying elite soldiers, not making feel-good stories for the evening news." The laughter that followed had been sharp and uncomfortable, but what hurt Sarah most was the fact that none of the other candidates had objected to Thompson's comments. She had stood there holding her tray, feeling the weight of 28 pairs of eyes evaluating her, judging her, and finding her wanting before she had even attempted a single exercise. Private First Class Tony Russo, a cocky 22-year-old from Brooklyn, had been the first to address her directly. He had approached her table during that first meal with a grin that didn't reach his eyes and a tone that dripped with false concern. "Hey, no offense, but are you sure you're going to be able to keep up with the training schedule?" he had asked, gesturing vaguely toward her prosthetic leg. "I mean, it's going to be pretty intense, and we don't want anyone getting hurt because they're pushing beyond their limitations." Sarah had looked up from her meal, meeting his gaze directly. "I appreciate your concern, but I passed the same preliminary assessment as everyone else here. I wouldn't be here if I couldn't handle the training." Russo had shrugged, but his expression had made it clear that he remained unconvinced. "Yeah, well, passing a one-day test is different from surviving 12 weeks of this program. But hey, good luck with that." The conversation had ended there, but Sarah had noticed how quickly word spread through the barracks. Within hours, she had become the subject of whispered conversations and speculative betting pools. Some candidates were wagering on how long she would last before dropping out, while others were making crude jokes about the military's evolving standards for inclusion. Captain Lisa Warren, the program's commanding officer, had called Sarah into her office on the second day for what she described as a routine check-in. Warren was a career military officer with 15 years of experience and a reputation for treating all soldiers with professional respect regardless of their background. But even she seemed uncertain about how to address the unique challenges that Sarah's participation might create. "I want to be clear about something," Warren had said, settling behind her desk with a folder containing Sarah's complete file. "You're here because you earned your spot through the same process as everyone else. Your prosthetic leg doesn't make you special, and it doesn't make you handicapped. It's simply a piece of equipment that helps you perform your duties. My expectation is that you'll meet the same standards as every other candidate, and I won't tolerate any discrimination or harassment from other members of the program." Sarah had appreciated the directness of Warren's approach, but she had also detected something else in the captain's tone. There was an underlying tension that suggested Warren was under pressure from higher-ranking officers who were concerned about the potential complications of having an amputee in such a high-profile program. The Advanced Combat Fitness Initiative received attention from military leadership across multiple branches, and any problems or controversies could have career-ending consequences for the officers responsible. "I understand, ma'am," Sarah had replied. "I'm not here to make a statement or prove a point. I'm here to train and to meet the standards that have been set for everyone." Warren had nodded, but her expression had remained troubled. "I hope that's true, because the next 12 weeks are going to test every aspect of your physical and mental capabilities. If you're here for the wrong reasons, you're going to wash out, and you're going to do it in front of people who are watching very closely." The warning had been clear, and Sarah had left the meeting understanding that her success or failure would be scrutinized far more intensely than that of any other candidate. She wasn't just representing herself. She was representing every service member with a disability who might follow in her footsteps. The training schedule at Camp Riverside was designed to push candidates to their absolute limits from the first day. Morning physical training began at 05:00 hours with a 5-mile run through the Georgia countryside, followed by strength and conditioning exercises that lasted until 08:00. After breakfast, candidates participated in specialized training modules that included combat simulations, tactical movement exercises, and advanced fitness assessments. Afternoons were devoted to individual skill development, team-building exercises, and preparation for the weekly evaluation challenges that determined who would continue in the program. Sarah's first week had been a brutal introduction to the reality of training alongside some of the most physically gifted soldiers in the Army Reserve. The morning runs were conducted at a pace that would have been challenging for most recreational runners, but her fellow candidates treated them as casual warm-up exercises. During strength training, she watched in amazement as soldiers who looked like they belonged in fitness magazines performed exercises that defied normal human limitations. But it was the subtle ways that her prosthetic leg affected her performance that created the most significant challenges. The titanium and carbon fiber device was a marvel of engineering, designed to provide stability and shock absorption during high-impact activities. However, it couldn't replicate the complex biomechanics of a natural limb, and the small compensations required to maintain balance and momentum accumulated over the course of long training sessions. During obstacle course training, Sarah found herself struggling with exercises that required rapid changes of direction or precise foot placement. The prosthetic leg's response time was slightly slower than her natural leg, and the artificial ankle joint couldn't provide the same range of motion as biological tissue. These limitations weren't debilitating, but they were noticeable, especially when she was training alongside candidates who moved with the fluid grace of natural athletes. The psychological pressure was even more challenging than the physical demands. Sarah could feel the constant evaluation from her fellow candidates, instructors, and program staff. Every stumble, every moment of fatigue, every instance where she finished slightly behind the group was noted and analyzed. She began to understand that she wasn't just competing against the training standards. She was competing against the preconceptions and assumptions that everyone brought to their assessment of her capabilities. Staff Sergeant Thompson had emerged as her most vocal critic during the first week. Thompson was a 12-year veteran who had served 2 deployments in Iraq and 1 in Afghanistan, and his military bearing commanded respect from even the most confident candidates. His criticism of Sarah's performance was never direct or officially documented, but his comments during group training sessions were clearly intended to undermine her confidence and credibility. Maintaining formation during a tactical movement isn't optional, Thompson had announced during a particularly difficult exercise where Sarah had fallen slightly behind during a simulated patrol. In combat, the soldier next to you needs to know that you can keep up regardless of the circumstances. Excuses don't stop bullets. The comment had been delivered to the entire group, but everyone understood that it was directed at Sarah. She had completed the exercise successfully, but her time had been 30 seconds slower than the group average. A difference that Thompson had made sure to highlight during the post-exercise debrief. Similar incidents occurred throughout the first week. During a rope climbing exercise, Sarah had struggled with the technique required to ascend a 20-foot rope using only her upper body strength. The prosthetic leg provided no assistance with the climbing motion, and she had been forced to develop an alternative technique that was effective but visually awkward. Thompson had watched her efforts with obvious skepticism, shaking his head as she worked her way up the rope. Upper body strength is critical for combat soldiers, he had remarked to another instructor, speaking loudly enough for Sarah to hear. You never know when you'll need to climb over a wall or pull yourself out of a dangerous situation. Some people are naturally suited for this type of work, and others might be better suited for different types of service. The implication was clear, and Sarah had felt the weight of every candidate's attention as she completed the exercise. She had successfully reached the top of the rope, but the effort had required nearly twice as long as the fastest candidates, and her technique had looked clumsy compared to their fluid movements. But it was during the first week's final evaluation that Sarah truly understood the depth of skepticism surrounding her participation in the program. The evaluation consisted of a comprehensive fitness assessment that included timed runs, strength exercises, agility drills, and a complex obstacle course that simulated combat conditions. Each candidate's performance was scored according to a detailed rubric, and the results would determine who would continue to the second week and who would be eliminated from the program. Sarah had prepared extensively for the evaluation, spending extra hours after regular training sessions practicing the specific movements and techniques that would be required. She had studied videos of previous candidates completing the obstacle course, analyzed the most efficient approaches to each challenge, and developed alternative strategies to compensate for the limitations of her prosthetic leg. The evaluation began at dawn with a 3-mile run through the challenging terrain surrounding Camp Riverside. The course included steep hills, muddy sections, and technical trail running that required careful foot placement and balance. Sarah had started near the back of the group, understanding that her prosthetic leg would make it difficult to maintain the pace set by the fastest runners. The first mile had gone well, with Sarah settling into a rhythm that felt sustainable. Over the full distance, her prosthetic leg was performing exactly as designed, providing stability and shock absorption during the downhill sections and maintaining traction during the uphill climbs. She had passed several candidates who had started too aggressively, and her positioning within the group had been respectable. But during the second mile, the technical nature of the terrain began to create challenges. The trail included a series of stream crossings where candidates were required to hop from rock to rock, maintaining momentum while avoiding the muddy water below. Sarah's prosthetic leg couldn't provide the same tactile feedback as a natural foot, making it difficult to judge the stability of each rock before committing her weight to it. On the third stream crossing, disaster struck. Sarah had misjudged the distance between two rocks and had landed awkwardly with her prosthetic leg extended too far forward. The artificial ankle joint had twisted beyond its normal range of motion, and the sudden shift in weight distribution had caused her to lose balance completely. She had fallen sideways into the stream, landing hard on her right shoulder and submerging her prosthetic leg in the muddy water. The fall itself hadn't been particularly dangerous, But the psychological impact had been devastating. Sarah had found herself sitting in 18 inches of muddy water, her prosthetic leg partially submerged, while 27 other candidates continued past her without stopping. The mechanical components of the prosthetic had continued to function normally, but the fall had shaken her confidence and reminded her of the fundamental differences between her capabilities and those of her fellow candidates. She had climbed out of the stream and continued running, but the remaining mile had been a struggle. The wet clothing and muddy prosthetic leg had created additional challenges, and she had finished the run nearly 5 minutes behind the fastest candidate. Her time had been within the acceptable range for continuing in the program, but it had been the second slowest performance of the day. The strength assessment had gone better, with Sarah's upper body conditioning allowing her to perform respectably in push-ups, pull-ups, and other exercises that didn't heavily favor her prosthetic leg. But the agility drills had highlighted the limitations of her artificial ankle joint, and her performance in exercises requiring rapid changes of direction had been noticeably slower than that of most other candidates. The obstacle course had been the final component of the evaluation, and Sarah had approached it with a mixture of determination and apprehension. The course included 12 different obstacles, each designed to test a specific aspect of military fitness and tactical movement. There were walls to climb, tunnels to crawl through, ropes to swing across, and barriers to vault over. The course was timed, and candidates were required to complete it within a specified time limit to avoid elimination. Sarah had developed specific strategies for each obstacle, understanding that her prosthetic leg would require alternative approaches to some of the challenges. The wall climbing obstacles could be completed using primarily upper body strength, while the tunnel crawling sections would require careful management of the prosthetic leg's bulk and mechanical components. The rope swinging obstacles would be the most challenging, requiring precise timing and coordination between her natural leg and the prosthetic. The obstacle course had started well, with Sarah completing the first 3 challenges within her planned time parameters. Her alternative techniques had been effective, if not elegant, and she had maintained a reasonable pace through the initial sections. But as the course progressed and fatigue began to accumulate, the small inefficiencies in her movement patterns had started to compound. During the 7th obstacle, a complex wall climbing challenge that required candidates to scale a 12-foot vertical barrier, Sarah had struggled with the technique required to pull herself up using only her upper body strength. Her prosthetic leg could provide some assistance with balance, but it couldn't contribute to the explosive power needed to complete the climb efficiently. She had eventually succeeded, but the effort had required nearly 3 minutes, while most other candidates had completed the same obstacle in less than 60 seconds. The final obstacle had been the most challenging, a rope swing across a simulated river that required candidates to grab a rope, swing across a 20-foot gap, and land on a platform on the other side. The obstacle demanded precise timing, upper body strength, and the ability to absorb the impact of landing while maintaining balance. Sarah had studied this obstacle extensively, understanding that her prosthetic leg would affect her ability to generate the initial momentum and absorb the final impact. She had approached the rope swing with careful preparation, calculating the exact timing required to release the rope at the optimal moment. The swing itself had gone well, with her upper body strength allowing her to maintain her grip throughout the crossing. But the landing had been problematic. Her prosthetic leg had absorbed the impact differently than her natural leg, creating an uneven weight distribution that had caused her to stumble forward upon landing. The stumble hadn't been a fall, and she had maintained her footing on the platform, but the awkward landing had been visible to everyone watching the evaluation. Staff Sergeant Thompson had been positioned near the final obstacle, and his expression had made it clear that he viewed the stumble as confirmation of his concerns about Sarah's suitability for the program. Despite the challenges, Sarah had completed the entire obstacle course within the required time limit. Her overall performance had been sufficient to avoid elimination, but it had been among the slowest of all candidates who continued to the kazing. Second week. The official scores were posted that evening, and Sarah's name appeared in the bottom quartile of continuing candidates. The psychological impact of the evaluation results had been significant. Sarah had known that her performance would be closely scrutinized, but seeing her name near the bottom of the rankings had been a stark reminder of the challenges she faced. She had qualified to continue in the program, but just barely, and the gap between her performance and that of the top candidates had been substantial. That evening, as Sarah sat in her bunk reviewing the day's events, she had overheard a conversation between several candidates that had crystallized her understanding of the situation she faced. The conversation had taken place in the common area adjacent to her sleeping quarters, and the participants had apparently assumed that she was either asleep or absent from the barracks. "I don't understand why they're letting her continue," Private First Class Russo had said, his voice carrying clearly through the thin walls. "She's obviously struggling to keep up, and it's just going to get harder from here. Someone's going to get hurt if she can't maintain the pace during team exercises." "It's probably a liability issue," another candidate had replied. "They can't eliminate her unless she actually fails to meet the minimum standards, even if it's then obvious that she's not competitive with the rest of the group. They're probably hoping she'd drop out on her own, so they don't have to deal with the paperwork." Staff Sergeant Thompson's voice had been the most cutting. "The whole thing is a distraction from the real purpose of this program. We're supposed to be identifying elite soldiers, not running a social experiment. Every minute we spend accommodating her limitations is a minute that could be better spent pushing the candidates who actually have a chance of succeeding." The conversation had continued for another 20 minutes, with various candidates offering their opinions about Sarah's prospects and the wisdom of including her in the program. Not a single voice had been raised in her defense, and several candidates had shared stories about her struggles during the first week's training sessions. Sarah had lain in her bunk listening to every word, feeling the weight of their collective judgment. She had understood that her performance during the evaluation had confirmed their preconceptions about her capabilities, and that her continued participation in the program would be viewed as an unwelcome distraction rather than a legitimate competition for one of the coveted spots in the final selection. But rather than feeling defeated by the conversation, Sarah had found herself experiencing something else entirely. The casual cruelty of their dismissal had ignited a determination that she hadn't felt since her earliest days of rehabilitation. After losing her leg, she had spent 3 years preparing for this opportunity, and she had no intention of allowing their skepticism to derail her progress. She had quietly retrieved her training journal from her locker and had spent the rest of the evening analyzing her performance during the evaluation. Each obstacle, each timed exercise, each moment of struggle had been documented in detail, along with notes about potential improvements and alternative strategies. She had identified specific areas where her prosthetic leg had created challenges, and she had begun developing plans to address those limitations during the remaining weeks of the program. The journal had become her most valuable tool during the preparation phase of her journey. It contained detailed analyses of prosthetic leg performance under various conditions, training schedules that maximized her strengths while addressing her weaknesses, and psychological strategies for maintaining focus under pressure. Every workout, every practice session, every moment of doubt or breakthrough had been recorded and analyzed. As she wrote in the journal that evening, Sarah had made a decision that would define the rest of her experience at Camp Riverside. She would not simply survive the remaining weeks of the program. She would transform herself into a competitor who could stand alongside the best soldiers in the Army Reserve. The evaluation had shown her exactly where she stood relative to her fellow candidates, and now she understood precisely what needed to be accomplished during the weeks ahead. The prosthetic leg that had been viewed as a limitation would become her greatest asset. The skepticism and dismissal that she faced from other candidates would become fuel for a level of preparation and dedication that none of them could match. The extra challenges that she faced would forge a mental toughness that would serve her well when the final test arrived. Sarah had closed the journal and had lain back in her bunk, listening to the quiet sounds of the barracks settling into sleep around her. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove her worth, and new chances to demonstrate that determination could overcome any obstacle. The conversation she had overheard had revealed exactly what she was fighting against, and now she knew exactly what she needed to do to win. The second week at Camp Riverside began with an equipment inspection that would forever change how Sarah understood the true nature of institutional bias. At precisely 0530 hours, all candidates were required to present their assigned gear for evaluation by the quartermaster's office. Each soldier's equipment had been carefully cataloged and maintained according to strict military standards, ensuring that everyone had access to the same high-quality tools necessary for optimal performance. Everyone except Sarah, Quartermaster Sergeant Patricia Hendricks, examined each candidate's gear with methodical precision, checking serial numbers against inventory lists and noting any discrepancies or maintenance issues. When she reached Sarah's equipment station, her expression shifted almost imperceptibly, and she spent considerably more time reviewing the paperwork associated with Sarah's prosthetic leg and related accommodations. The running shoes that Sarah had been issued were a half size too large, despite the specific measurements that had been submitted with her medical documentation. Her tactical vest had been adjusted for someone with a broader chest and longer torso, creating an uncomfortable fit that affected her balance during movement exercises. Most significantly, the specialized sock liner system that was essential for preventing chafing and pressure sores, where her prosthetic leg interfaced with her residual limb, had been replaced with standard issue alternatives that were completely inappropriate for her needs. When Sarah questioned the equipment discrepancies, Sergeant Hendricks consulted her clipboard with exaggerated thoroughness before responding with bureaucratic indifference. Your specialized equipment requests are still being processed through the appropriate channels. Standard issue gear will have to suffice until the paperwork is completed. Military operations don't wait for custom accommodations. The implication was clear and deliberate. Sarah's success or failure would depend not only on her ability to compete with naturally gifted athletes, but also on her capacity to overcome intentional sabotage disguised as administrative oversight. The ill-fitting equipment would create additional challenges during every training exercise, compounding the existing difficulties posed by her prosthetic leg. But the equipment issues were merely the opening salvo in what would become a systematic campaign of psychological warfare designed to break her resolve. Staff Sergeant Thompson had apparently decided that Sarah's continued presence in the program represented a personal affront to his professional standards, and he began orchestrating increasingly sophisticated efforts to demonstrate her unsuitability for elite military service. During the second week's first major training exercise, a 12-mile tactical march carrying full combat gear, Thompson implemented what he described as realistic combat conditions that seemed specifically designed to exploit Sarah's limitations. The march route included extended sections of loose sand and unstable terrain that made walking with a prosthetic leg exponentially more difficult. Unlike natural feet that could adjust and adapt to changing surface conditions, Sarah's artificial ankle joint provided limited feedback and required constant conscious adjustment to maintain stability. The weighted pack that each candidate was required to carry had been standardized at 65 pounds, but Sarah's pack had been loaded with equipment that created an uneven weight distribution. While other candidates carried gear that was carefully balanced to minimize fatigue and maximize mobility, Sarah's pack contained items that shifted and settled during movement, creating additional stress on her prosthetic legs mounting system and forcing her to compensate with muscle groups that were already working at maximum capacity. Thompson positioned himself near the most challenging sections of the march route, observing Sarah's struggles with obvious satisfaction. When she fell behind the main group due to the additional time required to navigate unstable terrain safely, he made no effort to conceal his commentary. Tactical movement is about maintaining unit cohesion under adverse conditions, he announced to nearby candidates, his voice carrying clearly to Sarah's position 20 meters behind the main formation. A soldier who can't keep pace with their unit becomes a liability that endangers everyone else's mission success. The psychological impact of falling behind was magnified by the knowledge that her struggles were being scrutinized and documented. Sarah could see other candidates glancing back at her position, some with expressions of sympathy, but most with the cold calculation of competitors who viewed her difficulties as confirmation of their own superiority. But it was during the march's final phase that Thompson's campaign reached a new level of calculated cruelty. As the group approached the finish line after 4 hours of grueling movement, he called for an impromptu equipment inspection that required each candidate to unpack and display their gear for verification. The exercise was allegedly designed to ensure that all required items had been carried throughout the entire march rather than cached along the route. When Thompson reached Sarah's position, he discovered that one of her required items, a specialized communication device, was missing from her pack. The device was essential for passing the exercise, and its absence would result in automatic failure regardless of her completion time or overall performance. Sarah was certain that she had packed the device according to the provided checklist, but her protests were dismissed with bureaucratic finality. Equipment accountability is a fundamental military responsibility, Thompson stated, marking her evaluation form with a bold red X. Soldiers who can't maintain control of their assigned gear pose a security risk during actual operations. This exercise is scored as a failure. The missing equipment had obviously been removed from her pack during one of the scheduled rest stops, when candidates were required to set down their gear while receiving tactical briefings. Sarah had no way to prove that sabotage had occurred, and Thompson's authority in scoring the exercise was absolute. The failure would be recorded in her official file as evidence of her inability to meet basic military standards. That evening, as Sarah sat alone in the barracks reviewing the day's events, she discovered the missing communication device carefully placed inside her locker, positioned exactly where she would find it when preparing for the next day's training. The device showed no signs of damage or malfunction, confirming that its removal from her pack had been intentional and temporary. Someone had taken it during the march and returned it after the exercise was completed, ensuring that Sarah would fail the evaluation while maintaining plausible deniability about the sabotage. The psychological warfare extended beyond equipment sabotage and tactical exercises. During the third week, Sarah began experiencing a series of minor but persistent harassment incidents that were clearly coordinated but difficult to document or prove. Her laundry would disappear from the communal washing facilities, forcing her to wear damp or dirty clothing during training sessions. Her bunk area would be subjected to unusually thorough inspections that resulted in demerits for microscopic infractions that were overlooked in other candidates' areas. The specialized prosthetic maintenance supplies that she required for daily care were repeatedly misplaced by supply personnel, creating potential health and safety issues that could have justified her removal from the program. Most insidiously, Sarah found herself increasingly isolated from informal social interactions that were crucial for building the camaraderie and mutual support that helped candidates survive the program's psychological pressures. Conversation would stop when she entered common areas, meal tables would mysteriously fill up before she could join them, and recreational activities would be organized without her knowledge or participation. The isolation was orchestrated primarily by a group of candidates led by Corporal Jake Mitchell, a former college wrestler whose combination of physical prowess and social influence made him a natural leader among the more competitive participants. Mitchell had apparently decided that Sarah's continued presence reflected poorly on the program standards, and he used his influence to ensure that she remained an outsider within the candidate community. Mitchell's approach was more sophisticated than Thompson's direct confrontation. Rather than openly challenging Sarah's capabilities, he employed subtle social manipulation that gradually eroded her support network and psychological resilience. His comments about her performance were delivered with apparent concern rather than hostility, making them difficult to characterize as harassment while still undermining her confidence. "I'm really worried about Sarah's safety during the team exercises," Mitchell would say during conversations that he knew she could overhear. "She's obviously pushing herself beyond her physical limitations, and someone's going to get hurt when she can't keep up during a critical moment. It's not fair to put the rest of us at risk because the program won't make the tough decisions." These conversations were carefully staged to seem like genuine expressions of concern, while actually reinforcing negative perceptions of Sarah's capabilities. Mitchell would position himself and his followers in locations where Sarah would inevitably encounter their discussions, ensuring that she heard every word while maintaining the pretense that their comments weren't intended for her consumption. The social isolation became particularly acute during the fourth week, when candidates were organized into four-person teams for a series of complex tactical exercises. Team assignments were supposedly random, but Sarah found herself grouped with three candidates who had been among the most vocal critics of her participation in the program. Her teammates, led by Private First Class Danny Rodriguez, made it clear from the beginning that they viewed her assignment to their team as a significant disadvantage. "Look, nothing personal, but we're here to win these exercises," Rodriguez explained during their first team meeting. "If you can't keep up with our pace, we need to know that up front so we can adjust our strategy accordingly. We're not interested in carrying dead weight just to make everyone feel good about inclusion." The team exercises were designed to evaluate leadership, communication, problem-solving, and tactical execution under pressure. Each four-person team was required to complete a series of increasingly complex challenges that simulated combat scenarios, with performance evaluated based on both individual contributions and overall team effectiveness. Success required seamless coordination and mutual trust among team members. Sarah's teammates made no effort to integrate her into their planning process or leverage her unique strengths. Instead, they assigned her to the least critical roles and developed strategies that minimized her involvement in key decision-making moments. During briefings, they would discuss tactical approaches and contingency plans while excluding her from meaningful participation, treating her as an observer rather than a full team member. The first team exercise involved navigating a complex obstacle course while carrying a simulated wounded soldier, with each team member rotating through different responsibilities during the evolution. Sarah's teammates assigned her to the least physically demanding role, but even this accommodation was delivered with condescending explanation about playing to everyone's strengths. When Sarah attempted to contribute tactical suggestions, based on her engineering background and analytical skills, her input was dismissed with polite but firm rejection. "We appreciate the thought, but we've already worked out our approach," Rodriguez would respond. "Why don't you focus on making sure you can handle your part of the exercise?" The systematic exclusion from team planning and decision-making created a self-fulfilling prophecy of poor performance. Sarah was expected to execute roles that she hadn't helped design, using strategies that didn't account for her capabilities or perspectives. When the inevitable coordination problems occurred, her teammates used the difficulties as evidence of her unsuitability for team operations. But the most devastating incident occurred during the fifth week, when Sarah discovered that her personal training journal had been stolen from her secure locker. The journal contained 3 years of detailed preparation notes, including specific strategies for compensating for her prosthetic leg's limitations, psychological techniques for maintaining focus under pressure, and analytical breakdowns of every aspect of the Advanced Combat Fitness Initiative that she had been able to research. More importantly, the journal contained deeply personal reflections about her motivations for pursuing military service, her fears about failing to honor her commitment to herself and others with disabilities, and her analysis of the discrimination and sabotage that she had encountered during the program. The theft wasn't just a violation of her privacy. It was psychological warfare designed to strip away her most valuable tool for maintaining mental resilience under extreme pressure. Sarah reported the theft through official channels, but the investigation was perfunctory and yielded no useful results. Security footage from the barracks was mysteriously corrupted for the relevant time period, and none of her fellow candidates claimed to have witnessed any suspicious activity. The theft was recorded as an isolated incident with no identified perpetrator, and Sarah was advised to be more careful about securing her personal property in the future. 2 days later, photocopied pages from her journal began appearing in anonymous locations throughout the training facility. Her most private thoughts and fears were posted on bulletin boards, taped to bathroom mirrors, and slipped under doors where other candidates would discover them. The personal reflections that had helped her maintain psychological stability were now being used as weapons against her confidence and credibility. The leaked journal entries were carefully selected to maximize humiliation and self-doubt. Her written concerns about whether she was truly capable of meeting military standards were highlighted and circulated as evidence of her own recognition that she didn't belong in the program. Her analytical notes about the discrimination she faced were characterized as paranoid complaints from someone looking for excuses for poor performance. Most devastating were the circulation of her deeply personal reflections about the accident that had cost her leg and her subsequent journey through rehabilitation and recovery. These intensely private thoughts about pain, fear, and determination were now public entertainment for people who viewed her vulnerability as weakness and her perseverance as delusion. The psychological impact of having her private thoughts weaponized against her was nearly overwhelming. Sarah had relied on her journal as a safe space for honest self-reflection and emotional processing, but now every thought and feeling had been violated and exposed. The tool that had been most essential for maintaining her mental health during the program had been transformed into a source of public humiliation. Staff Sergeant Thompson seized upon the leaked journal entries as an opportunity to escalate his campaign against Sarah's continued participation. During a group training session, he referenced her written concerns about discrimination as evidence of her inability to take responsibility for her own performance shortcomings. Military service requires soldiers who can focus on mission accomplishment rather than making excuses, Thompson announced to the assembled candidates. When someone spends more time documenting perceived slights than working to improve their actual capabilities, it demonstrates a fundamental misunderstanding of what military excellence requires. The public humiliation was compounded by the knowledge that her most private thoughts were now common knowledge among people who had already dismissed her as unworthy of their respect. Every interaction became laden with the understanding that others had read her fears, doubts, and motivations, stripping away the psychological privacy that was essential for maintaining dignity under pressure. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of the journal theft was how it undermined her ability to trust her own perceptions and judgments. The detailed documentation of discrimination and sabotage that she had carefully recorded was now being characterized as paranoid delusion, making her question whether the harassment she experienced was real or imagined. The systematic nature of the campaign against her was designed to gaslight her into doubting her own experiences and accepting responsibility for treatment that was clearly inappropriate. During the 6th week, The psychological warfare reached its crescendo with an incident that nearly broke Sarah's resolve entirely. She had been selected for a leadership exercise that required her to guide a team of candidates through a complex, tactical scenario while being evaluated by senior instructors. The exercise was designed to assess decision-making under pressure, communication skills, and the ability to maintain team cohesion during stressful situations. Sarah had prepared extensively for the leadership role, understanding that success would help counteract the negative perceptions that had been building throughout the program. She had developed detailed plans for the scenario, identified potential complications and contingency responses, and practiced the communication techniques that would be necessary for effective team coordination. But when she arrived at the exercise location, she discovered that the scenario parameters had been changed without notification. The tactical situation was completely different from what she had prepared for, the available resources were altered, and the time constraints were significantly more challenging than originally specified. Her teammates had apparently been briefed on the changes in advance, but she had been excluded from the updated information. The exercise became a disaster from the opening moments. Sarah was forced to make critical decisions based on outdated information while her teammates executed plans that she hadn't been informed about. The coordination failures were obvious and immediate, but the responsibility for poor performance was assigned entirely to her leadership failures, rather than the deliberate sabotage of her preparation. Staff Sergeant Thompson observed the exercise with undisguised satisfaction, documenting each moment of confusion and miscommunication as evidence of Sarah's unsuitability for leadership roles. When the exercise concluded with clearly inadequate results, he delivered his assessment with clinical precision. Effective military leadership requires the ability to adapt to changing circumstances and maintain team effectiveness regardless of unexpected challenges, Thompson stated, marking her evaluation with failing scores across multiple categories. This exercise demonstrates a fundamental inability to perform under the type of pressure that real military operations routinely involve. The failed leadership exercise was the culmination of weeks of systematic sabotage, but it was presented as objective evidence of Sarah's inherent limitations. Her protests about the changed parameters and excluded briefings were dismissed as excuses from someone unwilling to accept responsibility for poor performance. The official record would show only that she had failed a critical leadership evaluation, with no documentation of the circumstances that had made success impossible. That evening, Sarah sat alone in the barracks contemplating withdrawal from the program. The accumulated weight of equipment sabotage, social isolation, psychological warfare, and systematic discrimination had pushed her to the edge of her emotional and mental capacity. Her performance evaluations were consistently among the lowest in the program, not because of her actual capabilities, but because of the relentless campaign to undermine her success. The journal theft had stripped away her primary tool for psychological resilience. The equipment sabotage had created unnecessary physical challenges. The social isolation had eliminated sources of support and encouragement, and the leadership exercise failure had provided apparent justification for her elimination from the program. Every system that was supposed to ensure fair evaluation had been corrupted or manipulated to guarantee her failure. But as Sarah considered abandoning the goal that had consumed 3 years of her life, she began to understand something that her tormentors had not anticipated. Their systematic campaign to break her resolve had inadvertently revealed the exact nature of the challenges she would need to overcome. Every act of sabotage, every moment of discrimination, every attempt to undermine her confidence had provided valuable intelligence about the obstacles that stood between her and success. The equipment problems could be solved through careful preparation and alternative strategies. The social isolation could be endured through mental toughness and self-reliance. The psychological warfare could be defeated by maintaining focus, on long-term objectives rather than short-term harassment. Most importantly, the systematic nature of the campaign against her had revealed that her opponents viewed her as a genuine threat that required coordinated effort to eliminate. Sarah realized that the intensity of the harassment she faced was actually evidence of her potential for success. If she was truly as incompetent and unsuitable as they claimed, there would be no need for elaborate sabotage and psychological manipulation. The fact that they felt compelled to cheat in order to ensure her failure suggested that they recognized capabilities that she was only beginning to understand herself. The missing journal had contained years of preparation and analysis, but the most important insights were stored in her memory and couldn't be stolen or violated. Her understanding of her own capabilities, her knowledge of military fitness standards, and her analytical approach to problem-solving remained intact despite the theft of her written documentation. The journal had been a tool, but the real weapon was her mind, and that remained fully under her control. More importantly, the systematic harassment had forced her to develop mental toughness and emotional resilience that went far beyond what normal training could have provided. Every day of surviving their campaign had strengthened her psychological armor and proved that she could maintain focus and determination under conditions that would break most people. The skills she was developing through adversity would serve her well when the final challenge arrived. Sarah retrieved a new notebook from her personal supplies and began documenting her analysis of the 6th week's events. But this time, her approach was different. Instead of recording emotional reactions and personal fears, she focused on tactical intelligence about her opponent's methods and weaknesses. She began developing strategies that would not only allow her to survive their harassment, but actually use their expectations against them when the moment for demonstration arrived. The campaign to destroy her confidence had inadvertently provided a master class in psychological warfare and institutional bias. She now understood exactly how discrimination operated within military culture, how equipment and administrative systems could be manipulated to create disadvantages, and how social dynamics could be weaponized to isolate and undermine targeted individuals. But most importantly, she had learned that survival under these conditions required a level of mental toughness and strategic thinking that most people never developed. The candidates who were coasting through the program on natural athletic ability and social connections had never been tested in the ways that she was being tested daily. When the final challenge arrived, her psychological preparation would be far more complete than theirs. As Sarah wrote in her new journal, she began to recognize that every day of harassment was actually a gift. Her opponents were unknowingly providing the exact type of adversity training that would prepare her for the ultimate test of her capabilities. They were forging her into a competitor that they wouldn't recognize until it was too late to adjust their strategies. The systematic campaign against her had revealed something that even she hadn't fully understood before arriving at Camp Riverside. Her prosthetic leg wasn't her greatest limitation. It was her greatest asset. The extra challenges it created had forced her to develop problem-solving skills, mental toughness, and strategic thinking that gave her advantages that no naturally gifted athlete could match. The discrimination she faced wasn't evidence of her unsuitability for military service. It was proof that she represented something that threatened the established order. Her success would demonstrate that determination and intelligence could overcome any physical limitation, and that would challenge fundamental assumptions about what military excellence looked like. Sarah closed the new journal and prepared for sleep, understanding that the remaining weeks would bring even greater challenges. But for the first time since arriving at Camp Riverside, she felt genuine confidence about the final outcome. Her opponents had shown her their full arsenal of weapons, and she had not only survived but learned to use their attacks as fuel for her own preparation. The campaign to break her had instead revealed her true strength. Now it was time to show them what they had unknowingly created through their systematic harassment and discrimination. The final test was approaching, and Sarah was ready to demonstrate that their worst fears about her capabilities were actually underestimations of what she could accomplish when properly motivated. The prosthetic leg that they viewed as a symbol of limitation would become the foundation for a performance that would shatter every assumption about what was possible. The quiet engineer who had arrived at Camp Riverside 6 weeks earlier was gone, replaced by a warrior who had been forged in the fire of their own prejudice and emerged stronger than any of them could have imagined. The final challenge announcement came during Week 10 with the gravity of a military tribunal. Colonel Amanda Foster, the commanding officer of the entire southeastern training region, arrived at Camp Riverside in a convoy of black military vehicles that signaled the ultimate importance of what was about to unfold. Foster was a legend in Army fitness circles, a former Olympic marathon runner who had transitioned into military service and revolutionized combat conditioning protocols across multiple installations. Sarah stood in formation with the remaining 19 candidates as Colonel Foster stepped to the podium that had been erected in the center of the parade grounds. The morning air was thick with Georgia humidity, but an absolute silence had fallen over the assembled group as they waited to learn the nature of the test that would determine their fate in the Advanced Combat Fitness Initiative. "Ladies and gentlemen," Foster began, her voice carrying the authority of 3 decades in military service, "you have survived 10 weeks of the most demanding physical and mental conditioning that the United States Army has to offer. You represent the top 5% of candidates who began this journey, and each of you has demonstrated capabilities that exceed normal human limitations." The colonel paused, allowing her words to settle over candidates who had endured challenges that would have broken most people before reaching this moment. Sarah felt a complex mixture of pride and apprehension as she considered how dramatically her life had changed since arriving at Camp Riverside. The woman who stood in formation today bore little resemblance to the biomedical engineer who had first walked through the facility's gates 10 weeks earlier. The final evaluation will consist of a single test that will measure every aspect of your development during this program, Foster continued. You will compete in the Warrior's Gauntlet, a 5-mile course that combines distance running with 27 distinct obstacle challenges, designed to simulate the most demanding conditions that soldiers face in combat operations. The announcement sent a visible ripple through the formation as candidates absorbed the magnitude of what they were facing. The Warrior's Gauntlet was legendary within military circles, a test so demanding that completion alone was considered a mark of elite status. Success required not only peak physical conditioning but also tactical intelligence, psychological resilience, and the ability to perform complex movements while managing extreme fatigue and stress. Colonel Foster gestured toward a detailed map that had been displayed beside the podium, showing the complete route of the gauntlet with every obstacle marked and annotated. The course began with a 2-mile run through challenging terrain, followed by a series of increasingly difficult obstacles that included wall climbing, rope traverses, tunnel crawling, water crossings, and strength challenges that would test every muscle group in the human body. The course record currently stands at 37 minutes and 42 seconds, set by a Navy SEAL during last year's inter-service competition, Foster announced. However, completion time is only one factor in your evaluation. You will also be scored on technique, tactical decision-making, and your ability to maintain military bearing under extreme physical duress. Sarah studied the course map with the analytical intensity that had become her trademark throughout the program. Each obstacle represented a unique challenge that would require specific strategies, particularly given the limitations and capabilities of her prosthetic leg. The water crossings would test the device's waterproofing and her ability to maintain balance on slippery surfaces. The wall climbing obstacles would require upper body strength techniques that she had been perfecting for months. Most challenging would be the rope traverses that demanded precise coordination between her natural leg and the artificial limb. But as Sarah analyzed the technical requirements of each obstacle, she began to recognize something that filled her with cautious optimism. The course had been designed to test complete military fitness rather than pure athletic ability. Success would require problem-solving skills, strategic thinking, and psychological toughness as much as physical capabilities. These were areas where her unconventional background and unique experiences had given her advantages that most candidates didn't possess. The engineering mindset that had served her well during her civilian career was perfectly suited for breaking down complex challenges into manageable components. Her experience with prosthetic design gave her insights into biomechanics and efficiency that could translate into superior obstacle navigation techniques. Most importantly, the psychological resilience that she had developed through weeks of systematic harassment had prepared her for maintaining focus under pressure that would break most people. Colonel Foster concluded her briefing by announcing that each candidate would have 48 hours to prepare for the gauntlet, including time for course reconnaissance, equipment selection, and final training. The test would begin at dawn on Friday morning, with candidates starting at 3-minute intervals to ensure individual evaluation without direct competition effects. As the formation was dismissed, Sarah noticed the immediate clustering of candidates into informal groups for strategy discussion and mutual support. The social dynamics that had isolated her throughout the program continued even as they approached the final test, with most candidates naturally gravitating toward their established circles, while she remained on the periphery of their planning sessions. Corporal Jake Mitchell, who had emerged as the unofficial leader among the higher-performing candidates, organized an impromptu meeting in the common area to discuss optimal approaches to the gauntlet's most challenging obstacles. The session included detailed analysis of previous completion attempts, sharing of specialized techniques, and coordination of preparation schedules to maximize everyone's chances of success. Sarah approached the meeting with genuine intentions of contributing her analytical insights and learning from the tactical knowledge of more experienced soldiers. Her engineering background had given her unique perspectives on mechanical advantage, force distribution, and efficiency optimization that could benefit the entire group's preparation efforts. But her attempt to join the planning session was met with the same exclusion that had characterized her entire experience at Camp Riverside. Mitchell acknowledged her presence with polite but dismissive courtesy, making it clear that her input was neither desired nor welcome. "Thanks for the interest, Sarah, but we've got this covered," Mitchell said, positioning himself between her and the group discussion. "You might want to focus on your own preparation rather than trying to keep up with strategies that might not work for your specific situation." The dismissal was delivered with false concern that barely concealed the underlying message that she didn't belong among serious competitors. The other candidates avoided eye contact, neither supporting her inclusion nor objecting to her exclusion, maintaining the careful neutrality that had enabled the systematic discrimination she had faced throughout the program. Sarah retreated to her bunk area with the familiar sting of social rejection, but her emotional response was different than it had been during the early weeks of the program. The months of harassment and isolation had taught her that her greatest strength lay in self-reliance and individual preparation rather than group dynamics and social acceptance. She had learned to transform exclusion into motivation and use their skepticism as fuel for her own determination. Rather than dwelling on her rejection from the group planning session, Sarah retrieved her new journal and began conducting her own systematic analysis of the gauntlet course. She approached each obstacle as an engineering problem to be solved, identifying the specific challenges that her prosthetic leg would create and developing alternative techniques that could turn potential limitations into competitive advantages. The wall-climbing obstacles that others viewed as tests of raw upper body strength could be approached with mechanical advantage techniques that minimized energy expenditure while maximizing climbing efficiency. Her prosthetic leg's rigid structure could actually provide superior stability during certain climbing movements, eliminating the muscle fatigue that affected natural limbs during extended vertical challenges. The rope traverse obstacles that demanded precise coordination could be conquered through rhythm and timing rather than brute strength. Sarah's experience with compensating for her prosthetic leg's different response characteristics had taught her to excel at complex movement patterns that required conscious coordination between dissimilar limb capabilities. Most importantly, the psychological demands of the gauntlet would favor candidates who were accustomed to performing under pressure while managing additional complications. Sarah's daily experience of navigating the world with a prosthetic leg had prepared her for the type of multitasking and problem-solving under stress that the course would demand. As Sarah continued her analysis, she began to recognize that the gauntlet's design actually played to her unique strengths rather than highlighting her limitations. The course emphasized tactical intelligence and psychological resilience over pure athletic ability, creating an environment where her unconventional background could provide decisive advantages. The following day brought the official course reconnaissance, where candidates were allowed to examine each obstacle and practice specific techniques under instructor supervision. Sarah approached the reconnaissance with scientific methodology, documenting precise measurements, testing different approach angles, and experimenting with movement patterns that optimized her prosthetic leg's capabilities. At the first major obstacle, a 12-foot wall with minimal handholds, Sarah ignored the conventional climbing technique that most candidates were practicing. Instead, she analyzed the wall's construction and identified structural features that could be used to create mechanical advantage through alternative approach routes. Her engineering background allowed her to recognize stress points and leverage opportunities that others missed entirely. While other candidates focused on developing the upper body strength necessary for the standard climbing approach, Sarah perfected a technique that used her prosthetic leg's rigid structure to create a stable platform for more efficient upward movement. The technique looked awkward compared to the fluid movements of natural athletes, but it was actually more energy efficient and could be sustained over longer periods without fatigue. Staff Sergeant Thompson observed Sarah's unconventional approach with obvious skepticism, making notes that would undoubtedly reflect his continued doubts about her suitability for elite military service. His commentary during the reconnaissance was delivered with the same condescending tone that had characterized his interactions with her throughout the program. Creativity is admirable, but military operations require proven techniques that work under combat conditions, Thompson remarked as Sarah practiced her alternative climbing method. Experimental approaches might seem clever during training, but they become liability when lives depend on reliable execution. The criticism was intended to undermine Sarah's confidence in her innovative techniques, but it actually reinforced her understanding that her unconventional approaches were precisely what would give her advantages during the actual test. The fact that experienced instructors couldn't understand or appreciate her methods suggested that other candidates would be equally unprepared for the effectiveness of her strategies. Sarah continued her reconnaissance with methodical precision, treating each obstacle as a unique engineering challenge that required customized solutions. At the rope traverse section, she experimented with grip techniques that compensated for her prosthetic leg's inability to provide natural proprioceptive feedback. She developed timing patterns that synchronized her movements with the rope's oscillations, creating smooth forward progress that looked effortless despite the complex coordination it required. The water crossing obstacles presented particular challenges due to concerns about her prosthetic leg's performance in aquatic environments. The titanium and carbon fiber components were designed to handle water exposure, but submerged operation required specific techniques to maintain balance and traction on slippery surfaces. Sarah spent extra time at these obstacles, testing different approaches and building confidence in her equipment's reliability under challenging conditions. But it was during her analysis of the course's final obstacle that Sarah experienced a moment of revelation that would fundamentally change her approach to the entire gauntlet. The obstacle was a rope climb to a 30-foot platform, followed by a zip-line descent that required precise timing and coordination to land safely on a target area below. Most candidates were approaching the rope climb as a test of upper body strength, focusing on techniques that would allow them to ascend quickly despite the accumulated fatigue from the previous 26 obstacles. But Sarah's engineering analysis revealed that the real challenge wasn't the climb itself, but the energy management required to maintain performance capability throughout the entire course. She realized that her months of training with a prosthetic leg had given her insights into efficiency and energy conservation that naturally gifted athletes had never needed to develop. While other candidates relied on superior physical capabilities to power through challenges, she had learned to optimize every movement for maximum effectiveness with minimum energy expenditure. This revelation transformed her understanding of the gauntlet from a test of athletic ability into a competition of tactical intelligence and resource management. The candidate who could maintain optimal performance throughout all 27 obstacles would have decisive advantages over those who exhausted themselves during the early challenges. Sarah spent the remainder of the reconnaissance period developing an integrated strategy that treated the entire course as a single, complex system rather than a series of individual obstacles. She identified key points where energy conservation would be critical, planned her pacing to maintain consistent performance throughout the full distance, and developed contingency approaches for obstacles where her primary techniques might fail. The evening before the final test brought an unexpected development that would add another layer of complexity to an already challenging situation. Captain Lisa Warren called Sarah into her office for what was described as a final administrative review, but the meeting's actual purpose became clear within the first few minutes. "I've received reports about your unconventional training approaches and your apparent isolation from group preparation activities." Warren began consulting a file that contained detailed observations from the reconnaissance period. "I want to ensure that you understand the magnitude of tomorrow's challenge and the consequences of failure." The conversation that followed was carefully structured to create doubt about Sarah's readiness for the gauntlet, without explicitly discouraging her participation. Warren reviewed her performance statistics throughout the program, highlighting areas where her scores had been below average and emphasizing the increased difficulty of the final test. "The gauntlet has a failure rate of approximately 40%, even among candidates who have excelled throughout the preliminary training," Warren explained. "Given your unique circumstances and the performance challenges you've experienced, I want to make sure you've considered all your options before tomorrow's test." The implication was clear. Warren was offering Sarah an opportunity to withdraw from the program before experiencing the public humiliation of failing the final test. The conversation was framed as concern for her well-being, but it was actually another attempt to eliminate her before she could demonstrate her true capabilities. Sarah listened to Warren's concerns with the same composed demeanor that had carried her through 10 weeks of systematic harassment and discrimination. She understood that this final attempt to discourage her participation was actually evidence that some people recognized her potential for success and wanted to prevent the embarrassment of her proving them wrong. "I appreciate your concern, but I'm prepared for tomorrow's test," Sarah replied with quiet confidence. "I've trained for 3 years to reach this point, and I have no intention of withdrawing before demonstrating what I'm capable of accomplishing." Warren's expression suggested that she had expected this response, but she made one final attempt to plant seeds of doubt about Sarah's prospects for success. "The gauntlet is unlike anything you've experienced during the program. The accumulated fatigue, the psychological pressure, the technical complexity of the obstacles. These factors combine to create challenges that can break even the most prepared candidates. But rather than creating anxiety, Warren's warnings actually confirmed Sarah's analysis of what the test would require. The gauntlet would indeed be unlike anything most candidates had experienced, but Sarah's unique background had prepared her for exactly the type of multidimensional challenge that Warren was describing. The accumulated fatigue would favor candidates who had learned to perform under constant physical stress, as Sarah had done every day while adapting to life with a prosthetic leg. The psychological pressure would benefit those who were accustomed to maintaining focus while being scrutinized and criticized, exactly the conditions that Sarah had endured throughout the program. The technical complexity would reward candidates who approached challenges analytically, rather than relying solely on athletic ability. Sarah left Warren's office with increased confidence rather than the intended doubt. The conversation had revealed that even program administrators recognized her potential for success, despite their apparent desire to see her fail. The fact that they felt compelled to offer her an escape route suggested that they understood something about her capabilities, that she was only beginning to fully appreciate herself. The night before the gauntlet, Sarah engaged in her final preparation ritual with the systematic precision that had characterized her approach throughout the program. She inspected every component of her prosthetic leg, testing the mechanical systems and ensuring optimal calibration for the challenges ahead. She reviewed her course strategy one final time, visualizing her approach to each obstacle and mentally rehearsing the techniques she had developed during reconnaissance. But most importantly, she spent time reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this moment. 3 years earlier, she had been a biomedical engineer with a comfortable but unremarkable life, designing prosthetic devices for people whose experiences she couldn't truly understand. The accident that cost her leg had seemed like a devastating setback that would limit her possibilities and force her to accept a diminished version of her former life. Instead, that accident had revealed capabilities and strength that she had never known she possessed. The months of rehabilitation had taught her about resilience and determination. The decision to pursue military service had opened doors to challenges that most people never imagined attempting. The systematic harassment she had endured at Camp Riverside had forged mental toughness that would serve her in any future endeavor. As Sarah prepared for sleep, she understood that tomorrow's test would determine far more than her acceptance into an elite military program. It would validate the belief that physical limitations could be overcome through preparation, intelligence, and sheer force of will. It would demonstrate that determination could triumph over discrimination, and that unconventional approaches could succeed where traditional methods failed. The prosthetic leg that had been viewed as a symbol of limitation would become the foundation for a performance that shattered every assumption about what was possible. The quiet engineer who had arrived at Camp Riverside 10 weeks earlier was gone, replaced by a warrior who had been forged in the crucible of adversity and emerged stronger than anyone could have imagined. Dawn broke gray and humid over Camp Riverside as 19 candidates assembled for the final test that would determine their fate in the Advanced Combat Fitness Initiative. Sarah arrived at the starting area with her prosthetic leg perfectly calibrated, her equipment optimized for maximum efficiency, and her mind focused with laser intensity on the challenge ahead. Colonel Foster stood beside the starting line with a digital timer and evaluation sheets that would record every aspect of each candidate's performance. A team of observers had been positioned throughout the course to document technique, timing, and tactical decision-making at each obstacle. Military photographers were present to capture the historic nature of the test, and medical personnel were standing by to respond to the injuries that inevitably occurred during gauntlet attempts. The starting order had been determined by overall program rankings, with the highest performing candidates going first to set competitive standards for those who followed. Sarah's position near the end of the order meant that she would begin the course knowing exactly what times and techniques she needed to match or exceed. Corporal Jake Mitchell stepped to the starting line as the first candidate, his confidence evident in every aspect of his demeanor and preparation. Mitchell had been the standout performer throughout the program, excelling in every category and setting standards that other candidates struggled to match. His approach to the gauntlet was based on overwhelming physical capability combined with proven techniques that had been refined through years of elite athletic competition. The signal to begin sent Mitchell charging toward the first obstacle with explosive speed that immediately established the pace that would challenge every subsequent candidate. His progression through the initial running section was smooth and powerful, covering the challenging terrain with an efficiency that made the difficult course look almost effortless. Sarah watched Mitchell's performance with analytical detachment, noting his technique at each obstacle and timing his transitions between challenges. His approach was exactly what she had expected from a naturally gifted athlete: aggressive, confident, and relying primarily on superior physical capabilities to overcome technical challenges. As subsequent candidates completed their attempts, Sarah continued her systematic observation and analysis. Some candidates exceeded expectations with creative problem-solving and superior preparation, while others struggled with obstacles that exposed weaknesses in their training or technique. The course was proving to be exactly the comprehensive test that Colonel Foster had promised, separating truly elite performers from those who had simply survived the preliminary training. Private First Class Danny Rodriguez, Sarah's former teammate who had been among her harshest critics, approached the gauntlet with obvious determination to prove his superiority. His performance was solid and competent, but lacked the exceptional qualities that would distinguish him from the other candidates. He completed the course within acceptable parameters, but failed to achieve the breakthrough performance that would guarantee his selection for the program's final phase. As Sarah's turn approached, she could feel the weight of attention from observers who had come specifically to witness her attempt. The story of the female amputee competing in the elite military fitness program had attracted interest from military leadership and media representatives who understood the historic significance of her participation. Staff Sergeant Thompson positioned himself near the starting line with an expression that combined skepticism with barely concealed anticipation of her failure. His body language suggested that he viewed her upcoming attempt as the final confirmation of everything he had believed about her unsuitability for elite military service. But Sarah's mental state was unlike anything she had experienced during her 10 weeks at Camp Riverside. The systematic harassment, the equipment sabotage, the social isolation, and the psychological warfare had all served to prepare her for this exact moment. Every challenge she had faced, every obstacle she had overcome, every moment of doubt she had conquered, had been building toward this opportunity to demonstrate her true capabilities. Colonel Foster called Sarah's name and gestured toward the starting line where her journey through the warrior's gauntlet would begin. As Sarah took her position, she felt the familiar click of her prosthetic legs, locking mechanism and the surge of determination that had carried her through 3 years of preparation for this moment. The course stretched ahead of her like a battlefield where she would either validate every sacrifice she had made or confirm every doubt that had been expressed about her capabilities. 27 obstacles stood between her and the proof that determination could overcome any limitation, that intelligence could triumph over athletic ability, and that the human spirit could achieve the impossible when properly motivated. Sarah raised her hand to signal her readiness for the start command, understanding that the next 30 to 40 minutes would determine not only her own future, but also the possibilities for every person with a disability who dreamed of achieving something that others believed was impossible. The systematic campaign to break her spirit had instead forged her into exactly the type of warrior that the program was designed to identify. The final test was about to begin, and Sarah Chun was ready to show them what they had unknowingly created through their discrimination and harassment. The prosthetic leg that symbolized limitation was about to become the foundation for a performance that would redefine what was possible. The starting signal cracked across Camp Riverside like thunder. Sarah exploded forward with mechanical precision, her prosthetic leg striking the ground in perfect rhythm with her natural stride. The first 2 miles of terrain that had broken other candidates became her launching pad, each step calculated for optimal energy conservation while maintaining competitive pace. She reached the obstacle course section ahead of her projected timeline, her breathing controlled and her mind razor sharp. The 12-foot wall loomed before her, the same barrier where other candidates had burned precious energy through brute force climbing. Sarah's engineering approach transformed the challenge into elegant efficiency. Her prosthetic leg created a stable platform that allowed her to ascend using mechanical advantage rather than raw strength, clearing the obstacle in half the time of previous attempts. Staff Sergeant Thompson's jaw dropped as Sarah flowed through subsequent obstacles, with fluid grace that defied every assumption about prosthetic limitations. The rope traverse that had challenged elite athletes became a demonstration of perfect timing and coordination. Her artificial limbs' consistent response patterns created rhythm advantages that natural legs couldn't match. By the 15th obstacle, whispers rippled through the observer ranks. Sarah wasn't just completing the course. She was demolishing it with techniques that redefined optimal performance. Each challenge revealed new ways that her supposed limitation had become her greatest strength. The water crossing obstacles showcased her preparation's brilliance. While others struggled with balance on slippery surfaces, Sarah's prosthetic provided superior stability and traction. Her systematic approach to each stream and pool demonstrated tactical intelligence that left experienced instructors speechless. Colonel Foster checked her stopwatch repeatedly, unable to believe the times being recorded. Sarah was maintaining a pace that would challenge the course record while executing techniques that were textbook perfect. The systematic harassment had forged exactly the type of elite warrior the program was designed to identify. The final rope climb arrived with Sarah still operating at peak efficiency. 30 feet of vertical challenge stretched above her, with observers holding their breath as she began her ascent. Her upper body strength, developed through months of compensating for her prosthetic, powered her upward with machine-like consistency. Sarah reached the platform and launched into the zipline descent with perfect form. The landing required precise timing to hit the target zone, and her prosthetic leg absorbed the impact flawlessly. She rolled to her feet and sprinted toward the finish line as the digital timer displayed an impossible result: 29 minutes and 14 seconds. A new course record by over 8 minutes. The observers erupted in stunned applause as Sarah crossed the finish line, her breathing barely elevated after shattering every expectation. Staff Sergeant Thompson stood frozen, his preconceptions obliterated by a performance that redefined military excellence. Colonel Foster approached with official results that would make history. "Chun, you've just set a new warrior's gauntlet record and earned the highest evaluation scores in program history. Your techniques will be studied and taught for years to come." Corporal Mitchell stepped forward, removing his cap in genuine respect. "Ma'am, I owe you an apology. I've never witnessed anything like what you just accomplished. You didn't just beat the course. You revolutionized how it should be approached." Sarah's response carried the quiet dignity that had sustained her through months of adversity. "The course wasn't my real opponent. My real challenge was proving that determination and intelligence matter more than assumptions about what's possible." Within hours, military publications worldwide featured Sarah's achievement. Her photograph crossing the finish line became iconic, shared millions of times with headlines about redefining human potential. The Pentagon immediately offered her leadership of a new training initiative focused on adaptive combat techniques. Captain Warren's formal announcement echoed across the base. Sarah Chun has not only earned acceptance into our elite program, but has been selected as the Advanced Combat Fitness Initiative's first female Director of Innovation. She will develop training protocols for soldiers with diverse capabilities. The evening celebration found Sarah surrounded by candidates who had spent weeks dismissing her potential. Their respect was genuine now, earned through a performance that had shattered every barrier they thought existed. But Sarah's greatest satisfaction came from a letter that arrived the next morning from a young veteran who had lost both legs in Afghanistan. Your achievement showed me that my military career isn't over, it's just beginning differently. Thank you for proving that limitations exist only in our minds. Sarah had entered the warrior's gauntlet as someone fighting to prove she belonged. She emerged as someone who had redefined what belonging meant. Her prosthetic leg hadn't limited her performance. It had unlocked capabilities that others never knew existed. The systematic campaign to break her spirit had instead forged the most innovative military athlete in program history. Every act of discrimination had strengthened her resolve. Every moment of isolation had focused her preparation. And every assumption about her limitations had become fuel for impossible achievement. Sarah Chun had done more than complete an obstacle course. She had shattered the barriers between perception and reality, proving that the human spirit recognizes no limitations when properly motivated and prepared. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.